We have been tracing the one story of God through the book of Genesis and now into the book of Exodus. And let us remember that He has been revealing His plan of restoration, that He told Adam and Eve after they sinned in the Garden of Eden, that He was going to bring about a descendant of Adam and Eve that was going to crush the serpent. And it was this future descendant that we wanted to keep an eye out for, that we wanted to pay attention to how God was bringing that person. But we learned as we went through the book of Genesis that God's plan, it was going to take time, and that He wasn't going to bring that person right away. And so through the family line of Adam and Eve, we reach Abraham. And God, He established this covenant with him. He established that He was going to give Abraham descendants and a family that would be numerous as the stars. That He was going to promise a land that Abraham's family was going to inherit. Not yet, but one day in the future. But then also God said He was going to bless all of the nations through Abraham's family. And so we continue that line of blessing, that line of promise all the way from Abraham through his son Isaac, through his son Jacob, and through Jacob's son Judah. And it is with Judah that we want to pay attention to how is God and when is God bringing about that descendant that's going to restore the earth. And so as we turn from the book of Genesis into the book of Exodus, we might expect that the story of God would continue with the family of Judah. But that's not entirely the case. Yes, we're going to see the line of Judah pop up again in the Old Testament. But for the book of Exodus, the family line of Judah is actually going to kind of take a back seat to what God is doing in the people of Israel. So when we turn the page from Genesis into the book of Exodus, we need to pay attention to a few things. First of all, several years have passed. 400 years have passed from the ending of the book of Genesis to the beginning of the book of Exodus. And in that time, the family of Jacob, they have grown into this nation of Israel. They are no longer just a small family group, but they are an entire nation. But also in those 400 years, a new Pharaoh rose to power who did not remember Joseph and everything that God did through Joseph to save Egypt and the region from the famine that they were experiencing. Pharaoh was fearful of the Israelites because they had experienced God's blessing and they were able to be fruitful and multiply. They had grown tremendously in size. And so because of his fear that they might join with the enemies and overtake Egypt, Pharaoh, he decided to enslave them. And he made them do forced labor. And so now the people of God, the family of Abraham, they were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And so it's in the book of Exodus that God, He continues His story of redemption and restoration, but He's also going to set the foundation for how He wants to relate to His people. And so we want to pay attention to how the family line of Judah develops in the Old Testament. But right now in the book of Exodus, we're gonna step back and see on a larger scale how God wants to relate not just to the family of Judah, but to the whole family of Abraham. And so from the opening pages of the book of Exodus, we see that God, He is deeply concerned with His people. He hears their cries of suffering and pain. He sees their hardships and their toil. And so God, He raises up this leader named Moses. And just like Abraham was in the book of Genesis, Moses is going to be this picture of one who walks faithfully with God. And he's going to be one of the most important characters in the entire Old Testament because he is the one who God chooses to lead His people out of slavery, out of Egypt, and to the promised land. And in the events that are going to unfold in the first several chapters of the book of Genesis, we're going to see that God is going to display His power over Pharaoh, over the Egyptians, and He's going to show that, once again, no human can stand in the way of what God wants to do and what God is planning to do. And so God, he calls Moses to be that leader, to be that representation of God, both to the Israelites, but also to Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And God, he promises that he will be with Moses as he goes to lead the people away from Egypt. God's desire was that both the Egyptians and the Israelites, that they would come to know his great power. That he alone controls the world, he controls nature, and that people should submit to him out of reverence. But the Pharaoh of Egypt did not fear God. He didn't trust in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so these plagues that God sends is all about showing God's power and sovereignty over Pharaoh. But as we read the book of Exodus, we see that freedom from slavery in Egypt is going to come at a cost. That in order for God to deliver his people, for the people of Israel to experience salvation from the slavery of Egypt, it was going to come at a cost. And for them, the Israelites, it was going to cost them the sacrifice of a lamb. And it's only by that blood of the lamb that they are able to be saved from the death of the firstborn, but also freed from their slavery in Egypt. But for the Egyptians, it was going to cost the death of their firstborn. So it's in the midst of the judgment of death that we see God is offering his freedom and salvation to those who are going to obey him and to walk in his ways. But for those who do not respect him, do not fear him, do not obey him, there's going to be judgment and death. And through the miraculous powers and strength of God, he is able to deliver the Israelites and free them from slavery in Egypt. But God also knows that the Israelites, that they are not ready to inherit the land that he has promised them. He is going to have to teach them how to obey him. Because up until this point, they have been slaves in Egypt, and they don't know what it looks like to follow God, to worship him as a free nation. And so God, he is going to have to teach them what it looks like to walk faithfully with him, to obey his commands, to live in his life and blessing.